Hello, and welcome to our program. I'm your host, Michael Washington. Our program, as you know, was Afrocentricity, which is the community education broadcast of the Afro-American Studies program at Northern Kentucky University. This particular program is a very, very special one and is the first of a series of programs that we're going to feature the Underground Railroad. Our program today is entitled the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and we have as our guest public historian, Mr. Daniel Hurley.
Michael.
How are you doing there, Daniel?
Good.
Good. Now, you wanted to make certain that we distinguished you as the project manager, or at least the initial project manager, right, of this project, the Underground Railroad Freedom Museum, which is a national museum which will be in Cincinnati, planning now to be in Cincinnati, and you've played a fundamental role in this project. Could you just briefly give us an idea of how you got started as a public historian? Many people who watch our program are people who are in history and who are concerned that they can't find jobs. And it seems like you've been very successful in creating something for yourself here. Tell us about your background.
Well, I am trained as a historian, but one of the things that I've always believed is that if you do what you think is worth doing, you do what you feel you're good at, the job part of it will work itself out. So as an undergraduate, I knew I wanted to teach high school, but I didn't want to take those education courses, so I was able to find a way to do that. So I taught, went back to graduate school. My training is in American colonial history at William & Mary. But for the last 15 years, I've really focused on urban history and social history, especially in Cincinnati here because of working for the Cincinnati Historical Society. And then for the last 10 years, I've had my own company called Applied History Associates, and we do contract work for museums. I do a lot of video work for museums, for television stations, do books. We're working on 2 books at the moment, museum exhibits and corporate video history type of things. And then this project for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and I was lucky to be involved right from the beginning of this project 2.5 years ago, and it's sort of evolved into what it is today.
So you were one of the initiators of this idea.
Well, this all grew out of an effort by the local chapter of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And the local director is a man by the name of Chip Herrod. And that organization was coming up on its 50th anniversary. And they wanted to do something that was of lasting value to the city. They didn't just want to throw a party. They wanted to do something of lasting value. So they invited a number of people from around the community to sit down at a table one day and brainstorm ideas. And the director, Chip Herrod, threw out on the table an idea of an underground railroad museum. And at that meeting, very honestly, it didn't go too far. But Chip's a very persistent and also a tremendous leader and community organizer. He kept coming back to this. And what he came to me and he said, this is what we want to move forward with. Will you help me organize it? So I've been functioning on this project for 2.5 years, not so much as a historian, although I've done some of that. I've done mostly the management part, putting together the organization so that we could create an institution, as you were saying, that's going to be national in scope. It's going to be a major cultural facility that happens to be in Cincinnati. This is just as easily could be in Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. This is going to be an important institution that takes the historical experience of the Underground Railroad and uses that as a metaphor to help us understand not only the past, but the present and the question of relations between different cultural groups, different racial groups, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, when you say metaphor, could you give our audience some indication of what you mean by a metaphor, in the sense that I know they use the word innovative distributive museum. Does that have to do with what you're talking about here?
The distributive museum idea, one of the things you have to be concerned about with developing museums today is that some people would see museums as a wonderful 19th century technology that's kind of scary to be building new ones as you move into the 21st century because of changing communication capabilities and whatever. So what should a museum be? One thing about the Underground Railroad is it wasn't just in one place. This wasn't an experience that just occurred in Cincinnati or just occurred in Philadelphia or Baltimore or wherever. There are places all over the eastern two-thirds of the United States and Canada and Mexico and the islands in the Caribbean where enslaved peoples escaped to, frequently with little or no help from anybody, but also frequently with help from people they met along the way. That's a powerful story of self-determination. It's also a powerful story of people overcoming their fears and reaching a hand out. So in that sense, it's a metaphor for what we're challenged with today. How do we overcome our fears about the things that enslave us to take steps away from that towards freedom? And how do we reach our hand out when we meet someone who isn't like us and our first instinct might be to run, but how do we move across those barriers? In that sense, it's a metaphor. The distributive museum idea is that since there are hundreds of these sites all over the North American continent, how do we create a national, even an international center that doesn't say, come here because you'll learn everything, but come here because we'll put you in touch with all those other places. So through the internet, through satellite communications, we're building this facility to connect people from Philadelphia and Ontario, Canada, and Mexico and Florida through this center, people who all have common interests, but they don't know how to get in touch with each other right now. So that's the distributive museum aspect of this.
But we don't want to really look at it specifically as a museum concept, do we?
No.
I mean, the ideal here is that it'll be even a place for social gathering, social healing projects, if you will. Ideas having to do with racial healing, putting us in touch with the most divisive kind of elements that divide people. And this will be a climate, a place that can be safe,
absolutely.
sacred space.
This is a center, and we use that term very consciously and rejected the name or term museum. This is not about the past. This is about the present and the future. And this place will hopefully be a place, a common ground, a safe place for people to come together and honestly talk about what connects them and what separates them. So in that sense, it's a cultural facility that projects into the future, not just looks at the past. So this is not a museum in the conventional sense of the term. There will be some of those components there because we want people to learn from some of those issues that were confronted in the past, but that's the launching off place, as you say. This is an alive cultural center that we're envisioning.
Now, this was basically envisioned by you and Chip. Is that pretty fair to say?
Well, no.
Oh, no?
In the sense that one of the great things about the National Conference of Christians and Jews and about Chip Herrett is from the first moment, it was gathering people in to share ideas. So one of the first things we did was went off with a friend of yours, Cal Conliffe, who used to be on the Cincinnati School Board, and and Dr. Larry Hawkins, and we went up to the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center to meet with John Fleming, a superb museum director, an excellent historian in his own right, and someone who we felt we could learn from. So right from the very first beginning, we have been gathering people and trying to widen that circle out. When we went to do our feasibility study, which started just about 10 months ago, we did a national search. We distributed our request for proposals from across the nation. We got 11 full-fledged proposals. We brought people in from all over the country to interview, and our team is led by someone from San Francisco on the one hand, and a team partner from New York, and then several people from Washington, D.C. So this is not a local phenomenon anymore. And that was one of our goals right from the very early period, that we wanted to gather as many people in this community, but also in the nation, to build this concept. There was a vision there from the beginning, and that was really Chip's vision. There was a vision there from the beginning, but it was how to build that out. So it's not just a person or two, and as we move along, that quickly becomes clear.
So it's a kind of a networking concept in its own right, a people building concept. Now, this is July 9th, 1996. Where are we in the phases of the project? I know you've been working on this thing yourself for about 2.5 years,
right.
And it's really not projected to open until 4 or 5 years from now. Is that?
Well, and if you think about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., probably one of the best of the new types of museums, what I think of as not museums designed to impart information, but they're museums of conscience to touch people's, not only their minds, but their hearts. And I think we're in that category. That's the type of museum we want to be, type of facility we want to be. It took 17 years to get that facility open. Now, we're projecting that it'll take us a total of maybe 7 to 9 years. And if we do that, we're way ahead of the game in terms of not only the Holocaust Museum, but lots of other facilities of this type. So we would hope to be having the doors open about 2001, 2002. I'll tell you one thing we do want to be open for is the bicentennial of the state of Ohio for the year 2003, because we think this would be a wonderful topic for people coming into Ohio from the South, the gateway from the South, to be confronting Ohio, introducing themselves to Ohio through the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center.
Now, is that because of the infamous Black Codes of Ohio in 1803?
Well, I think this is the sort of topic that challenges people on lots of levels. You know, if for a lot of people who came through a normal school situation, things are drawn in very nice little lines. South was slavery, North was freedom. Well, as you know as a historian, the Black Codes are a wonderful example of this. There was a lot of the South in the North, and attitudes were much more complex than people think. Even, for example, abolitionists who hated slavery and wanted to end slavery didn't necessarily think African Americans were equal to whites. So even some of the most heroic sounding of the anti-slavery forces would be seen today as racist. And that's hard for, history is much more complex than people like to divide it up into neat categories. So coming into a place like Ohio, north of Kentucky, north of the river, north of slavery, gee, this was free territory. Well, as you know, with the Black Codes, technically a African American, a person of color entering the state, had to post a $500 bond in order to enter the state. Now, obviously, most people could not post that bond. They couldn't afford to do it. They lived here without posting that bond, but it was always on the books. And when the white community got upset with something in the black community, they could use those Black Codes to drive blacks out of the community. So in 1829, for example, there was a riot in Cincinnati, and a riot in the race riot in the 19th century meant whites storming the black community and driving blacks out of the city and into the hills. There were hundreds, maybe as many as 800 people who were driven from the city in 1829. Many of them left intending to go to Canada and form a new community in Canada called Wilberforce near London, Ontario. Not that many ever got there, but the point was, en masse, they left Cincinnati. So just because a person escaped slavery and came to the North didn't mean they achieved freedom in the normal sense of the term, either in America or anyplace else.
So if by by the year 2003, we can have a museum that could begin to address some of that as it relates to the past, to the present. You know, William Faulkner once said, "The past is not dead;
That's right.
it is not even the past," and that this museum can begin a process of creating an atmosphere that will be more healing, if you will,
Right.
of that history.
You know, and healing, though, not in the sense of falling into some new trite mythology. There's a lot of mythology around the Underground Railroad. I can't tell you how many times over the years of working in Cincinnati I've gotten calls from people. They've got a funny room in their basement, and certainly their house was on the Underground Railroad. And you do a little research and you find out the house was built in 1870 after the Civil War. And you say, well, no, it's not on the Underground Railroad. Doesn't dissuade them. Well, of course they were still on the Underground Railroad, but your house wasn't there. That happens all the time. People think there's a whole system of tunnels under the Ohio River. Well, they're not. I mean, people got across the Ohio River in skiffs, rowboats. I mean, all you have to do is look at the documents. But all this mythology is developed. What we don't want to fall into is just using the images of that old mythology, because that mythology is dangerous too. The thrust of that mythology tends to say that heroic, good white people helped poor, helpless black people escape the evils of slavery. There's a famous painting done in Cincinnati by Charles Weber's painting, and at the Art Museum. Wonderful painting.
Siebert's book was kind of inspired by that back
Absolutely.
in the 1890s.
In the Columbian Exposition of 1893. But if you look at that painting, it's the whites who are in the center, and it's the blacks who are sort of being helped along. Well, again, if you go back to the documents, that's not the way the documents read at all. The major actor in the Underground Railroad was the runaway person who had been enslaved. That person made a decision to take their own life in their hands and act on their own. And also, interestingly enough, this idea that whites were the main actors on the Underground Railroad in terms of helping people, runaways, not true. James Birney, who was certainly brave in his own right, the first publisher of The Philanthropist.
Had been a slave owner himself.
Had been a slave owner himself.
Alabama and Kentucky, freed his slaves and came here and began to do abolitionist work.
Did abolitionist work, risked his life to do that abolitionist work. But he writes in some letters that the black community in Cincinnati took care of runaways, and he rarely heard about anybody passing through until they had already passed through. In other words, the black community didn't even trust somebody like Birney, who had put his life on the line for the cause. So there were people inside the black community that ran. So we've got to deal with those. You know, one of the things about mythology, though, we don't want to just dismiss it. Don't want to play that old historical trick of poking fun at dead people who, you know, it's the reality here is that people created that mythology for a reason. They created it because they wanted to interpret themselves or their ancestors into the parts of the past, into the parts of history that they came to see as good and heroic. So it's like asking in 1977 how many people voted for Richard Nixon. In 1977, you couldn't hardly find anybody who voted for Richard Nixon, even though he won by the biggest landslide ever in 1972.
Right.
You know, we reinterpret history real quickly to meet our own purposes, and that's happened with the Underground Railroad. So the history we're going to do here is the history that's going to put the African American at the center of the story, because that's who was at the center of the story.
Well, who were some of the players in creating this thing? AMS, Charles Blockson, Dr. James Horton. Tell us about some of the players.
There are a lot of people. On two of the most interesting. Charles Blockson is a archivist, a collector from Philadelphia who has devoted much of his life to the study of the Underground Railroad. And he just headed up a 3-year advisory committee for the U.S. National Park Service on the question of the Underground Railroad. We have worked very cooperatively with them and with that committee, and Dr. John Fleming from Wilberforce was part of that committee. And Bloxham wants to see a whole series of things done in relationship to the Underground Railroad, and a National Interpretive Center would be one of those, and that's what we're sort of about. We've brought Dr. Bloxham to town to speak. He's written several books. His most recent is the Hippocrene Guide to the Underground Railroad.
Which I have in my hands right here.
Just came out about a year and a half ago, and it's a locational guide. He is also the first person, the first African American to write a cover story for National Geographic, and it was on the Underground Railroad.
Was that in 1984? Was that the one in...
Yes, I think it was 1984. And Dr. James Horton from George Washington University.
An enthusiastic historian, I might add.
Oh, great personality, wonderful writer. His most recent book, Free People of Color, his most recent monograph. He's got a new book out from the Smithsonian Press called A History of the African American People. A history or the history, I'm not sure. But Jim is a great writer, a great historian, and he has focused on the free black communities of Cincinnati and Boston and Philadelphia, and has really gotten at this story of who these people are and what they were doing. He has been a major advisor to the project from early on. I've known him for well over a decade, 15 years, and from the time he was doing some of his early research. So he's been involved. Then an interpretive planner by the name of Richard Rabinowitz from an organization in New York City called American History Workshop. And Dr. Rabinowitz made his mark in the historical profession when he created the Education Center at Sturbridge Village. A lot of people have been to Sturbridge, a very big colonial center. Richard is a great interpreter. So we've pulled together this team of people with all these, some historians, some AMS Planning and Research. They're a marketing firm. In that sense, we're going to be different than other museums too. We don't want to build something and then say, well, who's come to this? We've been out for the last 6 months doing telephone interviews, doing intercepts surveys with people at places like the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, Colonial Williamsburg. We have been talking to people. What do they know about the Underground Railroad? Would they be interested in coming? What would they like to learn about? What don't they want to see if a facility was created like this? We've been talking to thousands of people, literally, about what it is they want. So we're doing our marketing studies up front, and we think that'll pay off in the long run.
Now, we introduced you earlier as the project manager.
Right.
Isn't it kind of strange to have a white guy managing something like this? I mean, what role, for instance, does Mr. Edwin Rigaud play in this thing?
It plays a very important role. I'm not sure it's strange, because I have spent my adult life believing that whites and African Americans can work together as equals and on shared team. I'm not sure it's strange. I think it is awkward, though. And for 2.5 years, I was saying that ultimately this project has to be headed by an African American. And on our working teams from the beginning, we've always paired our co-chairs. We have an African American and a white. On committee chairs, on our staff, our consultant staffs, we have brought people of different racial backgrounds together. About 4 months ago, Procter & Gamble made a very important commitment to this project. They took one of their top vice presidents, who happens to be African American, the vice president for foods and whatever, I'm not sure the total structure there, a man by the name of Ed Rigaud, and loaned him to this project full-time for 2 years. Now, this is a tremendous statement by Procter & Gamble that they believe in this project and they want this project to succeed. Ed brings not only his managerial skills and his business interest and his marketing experience to the project, but he brings a tremendous energy. As he says, he has spent most of his adult life becoming successful, and he certainly has been very successful. He is now committing this phase of his life to doing something that's significant. And for Ed, it's like a new source of energy for him. And he's taken this on. He has contacts that I don't have, I mean, nationally, because of that experience out of P&G. So he's a wonderful person.
And when I use the word strange, of course, you know I was being facetious.
Well, I know.
Because even the NAACP was created by people.
But I think that's a legitimate question that we have to be concerned about.
Now, we only got a couple of minutes left, in fact, less than 2 minutes. Where will this museum be located physically in Cincinnati? How will it look? And why Cincinnati? A lot of stuff to say in a minute and a half, but give it a good shot.
Okay, first off, where it'll be. It will be in relation to the Ohio River. That's the great symbol of the dividing line between slavery and freedom. As you know, what's going to go on the riverfront is an open question at the moment. So how do we fit into that? That's still to be worked out. There's a couple of big gorillas called football and baseball that are going to have a lot to say about that. In terms of the second part of your question, why Cincinnati?
Why Cincinnati?
Well, why Cincinnati was because somebody needed to do this. One of the most amazing things about this project, and we brought Ralph Applebaum, the chief designer for the Holocaust Museum in town, to consult for us, and he said he couldn't believe it that there wasn't already a museum about this topic because it's of such interest to people. So why is it in Cincinnati? Because we've taken the initiative, because people like Chip Herrod and Ed Rigaud, Larry Hawkins, Harry Whipple at the Enquirer, they have said this needs to be done, and why not do it right here, and it would be good for Cincinnati. So that's why it's happening, but there's plenty of historical reasons. This was the maiden city in the American West. A lot of activity here, and probably as well-developed Underground Railroad network here as any place else in the country.
Levi Coffin, John Rankin, these are names that we associate with it, but as you point out, much of it was taking place without even those guys knowing exactly what was taking place.
That's right. People like John Parker. If you go to Ripley, everybody hears about John Rankin. Well, at the bottom of the hill, right by the river, is John Parker, an African-American who owned a foundry, certainly as important as Rankin, but his house has been falling into ruins. It's now been saved and will be restored.
And I'm getting the sign that we have to wind down now,
okay.
And the restoration is taking place basically through efforts by the local committee that's helping put that thing together down there.
Some common interest, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Hurley, Daniel Hurley. This has been the first of our series of Underground Railroad. The next time we'll be talking about our Canada connection, and we'll be featuring, I just had the book signed. This is the same book that Harriet Beecher Stowe used to do Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we'll be talking about this on our next program. Thank you. Bye-bye.